If this teaching finds you, your broke years are ending. Don't skip. Florence Scovel Shinn. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the very moment you stop straining and struggling for supply is the moment supply comes rushing to meet you halfway. And if you have ever lain awake doing math you did not want to do, this teaching was written for the exact room you are sitting in right now. There is a verse tucked into the book of Isaiah, chapter 65, verse 24, and it reads like this: "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are yet speaking, I will hear." And Florence Scovel Shinn would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it?" The answer was never waiting on your calling. The answer was already spoken before the need ever left your lips, which means your broke years were never waiting on the economy to change, or the job to come through, or the check to arrive. They were waiting on you to stop calling out from lack and start speaking from a supply that was already given. And here is where most people miss it entirely. They think the way out of broke is to work harder at getting, when Florence Scovel Shinn taught plainly that the way out of broke is to stop assuming lack as your identity, because it is not the empty account that keeps you poor, it is the full belief in the emptiness that keeps the account that way. So before we go any further, let us give your lips something new to say, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the spoken word is a creative power moving out into the unseen to shape the seen, and lack simply cannot survive very long in a mouth that keeps decreeing supply. So say it with me now. My supply is already spoken, my faith is already active, my word is my wand, and again, my supply is already spoken, my faith is already active, my word is my wand. Now if something in you just went quiet when you heard that, if some old, tired, worn-out part of you finally exhaled, then type these two words in the comments below: end of broke years. Let it be your seal. Let it be the line drawn between who you have been and who you are quietly becoming. The first key is understanding that broke was never a condition of your bank account. It is a state of consciousness you agreed to and then mistook for a fact. And this distinction is everything, because a fact cannot be argued with, but a state can always be changed. Picture the woman who checks her banking app 5 times before lunch, watching the same number, feeling the same drop in her stomach each time, as though checking harder might change what is written there. She checks it once on the drive to work, again in the parking lot, again at her desk before the first meeting, again after lunch, again before she falls asleep, and each time the number has not moved, but something inside her has, a little tighter, a little more convinced, a little more certain that this is simply who she is now, the one who is always short. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this is precisely backward, because you do not change an outer number by staring at it in fear, you change it by withdrawing your attention from the appearance and placing it on the truth behind the appearance. It is not the account that is empty, it is the acceptance that has been empty, run for years without question, and here is what makes this so easy to miss. The number on the screen feels like the most honest thing in the room. It feels like proof. It feels like the one thing that cannot be argued with. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn would gently ask you, whose report are you going to believe? The report of the appearance, or the report of the truth, that supply is already spoken and already yours? This is not a small rhetorical question. It is the entire hinge the rest of your life swings on, and once you see that broke is a state you can actually walk out of, the way you would walk out of a room that has grown too small for you, something in the chest loosens, because a state can be changed, where a fact feels fixed, and this is not denial of the number on the screen, it is refusal to let that number be the last word on your life. Florence Scovel Shinn would say the last word belongs to the word you speak next, not the number staring back at you. So this week, when you catch yourself opening that app out of fear rather than need, pause, right there in the parking lot, or the kitchen, or wherever you happen to be standing, and say quietly, "This number describes where I have been, It does not describe where my word is now taking me. And let that be enough for today. Because once the state shifts, the number is simply the last thing to catch up. It always is. It never leads. And you will spend the rest of your life watching the outer world explain what your consciousness has already declared. And the state you hold in secret is far louder than the number on any screen, far louder than the bill in the mailbox, far louder than the balance glowing on the glass. And that state is exactly what we turn to next. I refuse the appearance of lack, and I claim the fact of supply. The second key is seeing that your state of consciousness is the actual supply chain running underneath your life, more real than any paycheck, more binding than any contract. Picture two women, both with the same rent due on the first, both short by the same amount. One paces the kitchen at midnight, rehearsing the eviction notice she has not received, feeding her fear with every worst outcome her mind can invent, and the other sits still, breathes, and simply says, "Supply meets me at the exact point of my need," and rests there, not pretending the bill does not exist, but refusing to marry her identity to the fear of it. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that these two women are not living in the same world at all, though their circumstances look identical on paper, because one is broadcasting a state of panic into the unseen, and one is broadcasting a state of expectancy, and the unseen has no choice but to answer whatever is broadcast most consistently. It is not the rent that is threatening either woman. It is the feeling of threat that one of them has been renting out room in her own mind for years, paying it interest daily in worry. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say the outer rent is small compared to the inner rent charged by a fearful state held too long. Now widen this a little further, because the same law is not only working on rent, it is working in every ordinary transaction of the day. Picture a man scrolling job listings late at night, applying to 5, 10, 15 postings, and with every single click, a small voice underneath, saying, "They will not want me. This will not work either." And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, "Notice. He is applying with his hands, while declining himself in his own heart, and no amount of applications can outrun a state that has already decided the answer before it arrives, because the state is the actual signal going out. The application is only the outer motion. This is why two people can send out the very same number of requests, the very same effort, the very same qualifications, and one is met with door after door quietly opening, while the other collects rejection after rejection. And it was never about the resume, it was about which state stood behind the hand that pressed send. It is not the circumstance that decides your supply, it is the state you hold about the circumstance. This is worth saying slowly, because it corrects the oldest mistake in the mind, the mistake of believing the outer condition is the cause, when it was only ever the effect. The rent is not the cause of her fear. Her fear was already present long before the rent came due. The rejection is not the cause of his discouragement. The discouragement was already sitting in the state before the listing was even opened. And once you see this clearly, you stop trying to negotiate with circumstances and start negotiating with the only thing that was ever actually in charge, the state itself. Here is the part that changes everything once you truly absorb it. The state you hold is not decided by your circumstance. It is decided by you, moment to moment. Which means the woman pacing the kitchen has the very same access to rest that the other woman has. She has simply not yet claimed it, and the man refreshing job listings at midnight has the very same access to quiet expectancy that would change everything about how his effort lands. He has simply not yet remembered it is his to claim. So pause for a moment right now and pick one real circumstance currently pressing on you. A bill, a job, a decision, and ask honestly, what state have I been holding about this? Not what have I been doing about it. What have I been feeling underneath the doing? Because that feeling is the actual signal traveling ahead of you into rooms you have not even entered yet. So this week, When a bill or a demand lands in your hands and your stomach tightens, do not argue with the tightening. Just notice it, name it gently, and say, I am not required to hold this state. I choose instead the state of supply already meeting me, and say it as many times as the fear returns, because the fear will return. That is what old states do. They knock on the door out of habit, long after you have changed the locks. But each time you answer the door with the new word, instead of the old fear, the state is strengthened a little further, until one day the knocking simply stops, because the words you speak repeatedly are what built the fearful state in the first place, and it is to those very words we turn now. I choose the state of supply, and I let all lesser states pass through. The third key is recognizing that the spoken word is your wand, quite literally, and it works whether you are aiming it on purpose or not. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that words spoken in faith become law just as surely as words spoken in fear become law. The unseen does not grade your words for good intention. It simply takes the word and gets to work building the matching form. Picture the man who has said for 15 years, I can never hold on to money, said it at family dinners as a joke, said it to co-workers as small talk, said it to himself in the mirror as a kind of resigned honesty, and watch how faithfully his outer life has arranged itself to prove him right, not because money is cruel to him, but because his own mouth has been continually decreeing the very condition he complains about. It is not the universe punishing him for something he did. It is his own words returning to him, dressed up as circumstance, appearing so naturally that he never once suspects his own voice as the author. And Florence Scovel Shinn would gently stop him and say, your words are not describing your life, they are building it, brick by spoken brick. And it is never only the big dramatic sentences that do this work. It is the small automatic ones, the ones said so quickly they barely feel like decrees at all. Picture a woman standing at a checkout counter, glancing at a total slightly higher than she expected, and hearing herself say, of course, that is just my luck, said lightly, almost as a reflex, said the way a person clears their throat. And yet Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the unseen does not weigh a sentence by how casually it was said. It simply hears the sentence and moves to fulfill it. So that woman, without ever meaning to, has quietly renewed a subscription to bad luck she never consciously signed up for in the first place. And she will do it again tomorrow, at another counter, over another small thing, each time believing she is merely describing a fact, when she is actually laying another brick. This is why Florence Scovel Shinn taught that idle words are rarely idle at all. A sentence like, I never catch a break, spoken absent-mindedly while waiting for coffee, is still a full decree. A sentence like, money just slips through my fingers, spoken while laughing about a purchase, is still a full decree. The tone can be light, the intention can be harmless, and the unseen will still take it seriously, because it does not read your mood, it reads your word. And this is also the good news hiding inside the same law, because it means the smallest daily sentence carries just as much creative weight as the largest declared prayer. So this week, listen to your own casual sentences, the way you would listen to a stranger you were curious about. Notice what you say about money without thinking. Notice the little jokes, the little sighs, the little I never haves, and each time you catch one, do not scold yourself. Simply replace it on the spot. Say instead, my word is my wand, and I aim it now towards supply, because a wand does not care how long it was pointed the wrong direction. It only cares where it is pointed now. And once you begin guarding your speech this closely, you will notice something remarkable. The very same tongue that built the broke years is fully capable of building what comes after them, and that rebuilding begins with the deeper matter of what you actually believe yourself to be. My word is my wand, and I aim it only toward supply. The fourth key is understanding that beneath every state, beneath every spoken word, sits the deepest layer of all, your self-concept, the quiet, private answer you give yourself when nobody is asking, when you whisper to your own soul who you actually are. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this self-concept is the blueprint the entire outer life is built from, more powerful than any single wish, more binding than any single circumstance. Because you cannot out-earn a self-concept that believes it is small. You cannot out-save a self-concept that believes it is behind. You can win a windfall and watch it slip through your fingers within months, if the self-concept underneath still whispers, "I am the kind of person money does not stay with." And this is why so many people experience a strange cycle. A raise arrives, and within weeks the expenses rise to match it. A gift arrives, and within days something breaks that costs exactly that amount, and they call it bad luck. But Florence Scovel Shinn would call it something else entirely. She would call it a self-concept balancing the books to match its own quiet belief, because the outer world is endlessly loyal to the inner claim. Whether that claim was chosen consciously or absorbed by accident in childhood. First, consider where this self-concept was formed. Most people never chose it on purpose. It was handed to them. A father who flinched every time the electric bill arrived. A mother who said money does not grow on trees so often that it became scripture. A household where scarcity was simply the weather everyone lived under. And a child does not question weather. A child simply learns to dress for it and grows into an adult still buttoning up the same old coat against a storm that may not even be forecast anymore, still flinching at bills out of old habit long after the actual danger has passed. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the first task is simply naming this, not blaming anyone for it, but naming it clearly, saying to yourself, "This belief about money was given to me. It was not born with me, and what was given can be exchanged for something truer." Second, consider how quietly this self-concept operates once it has settled in, because it rarely announces itself as a belief at all. It disguises itself as simple realism. Picture a man who has worked the same steady job for years, capable, well-liked, quietly overlooked every time a promotion is handed out. And when a co-worker with far less experience is chosen instead, he tells himself the company simply does not value loyalty, and perhaps that is even partly true. But Florence Scovel Shinn would ask you to look one layer deeper, because this same man, without realizing it, has spent 15 years describing himself as the reliable one who stays in the background, the steady hand nobody thinks to promote, and he has said it so often, in so many small ways, that his own bearing in every meeting quietly confirms it. He sits a little further back. He offers his best ideas privately, instead of in the room where decisions are made. He apologizes before he speaks. None of this is conscious sabotage. It is simply a self-concept fully at work, arranging his posture, his timing, his very presence to match what he has quietly decided about himself. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that no promotion, no lucky break, no outside kindness can override a self-concept that has not yet agreed to change, because the world is only ever answering the question you have already answered about yourself. Third, consider that the self-concept can be caught red-handed in the small, ordinary moments of a day, not only in the big, dramatic ones. So pause for a moment right now and pick one real belief you carry about yourself, around money, something specific, not vague. Perhaps it is "I am always the one who has to make do with less." Or perhaps it is "people like me do not get the easy breaks." Hold that sentence in your mind for a moment and simply ask, whose voice was this originally? Because most of the time, when you trace it back far enough, it was never fully your own voice to begin with. It was borrowed, and a borrowed belief can absolutely be returned. Fourth, consider that this self-concept does not only shape the big decisions, it shapes the tiny ones you never even notice deciding, the item quietly put back on the shelf before checking the price at all, the smaller portion ordered out of habit rather than hunger. the compliment on a raise or a new car that gets brushed off with a joke instead of received simply. All of these are the self-concept speaking in whispers, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the whispers matter every bit as much as the declarations, because a life is built far more from its habitual whispers than from its rare dramatic statements. So it is worth listening closely this week to what you whisper to yourself in exactly these small, unguarded moments, not the moments you rehearse, but the moments you forget anyone is listening, including yourself. Fifth, consider the replacing itself. And this is where Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching becomes wonderfully practical rather than merely comforting, because she taught that you do not argue the old self-concept into silence. You simply stop feeding it and begin feeding a new one instead. So where the old sentence was, "I am always the one who has to make do with less," you plant instead, "I am the one supply flows toward easily and naturally," and you plant it not as a hopeful wish, but as a decree, spoken with the same weight you once gave the fear, quietly, repeatedly, especially in the exact moments the old belief tries to surface, because that is precisely the soil it needs to be replanted in. And this replanting is rarely dramatic. It looks like the man from before, sitting slightly closer to the front of the room, offering his idea a moment sooner than he normally would. Small, almost unnoticeable shifts, and yet each one is the new self-concept, taking its first careful steps into the visible world. And here is the part most people never realize until it is pointed out plainly. The world you are currently living in, the specific texture of your bank balance, your job, the way opportunities do or do not seem to find you, all of it is simply the self-concept of yesterday, fully grown and standing in front of you, wearing a coat made of circumstance. It is not a verdict on your worth. It is only a photograph of a belief you held some time ago, developed and printed in full, which means the self-concept you plant today is the photograph developing right now for the months ahead. So this week, catch yourself in the ordinary moments, standing in line at the store, opening an email, glancing at a price tag, sitting quietly in a meeting where you might normally hold back, and ask gently, what am I assuming about myself in this moment? And if the assumption is small, replace it not with strain, but with the calm certainty of someone quietly correcting an old rumor about themselves, the way you might correct a stranger who has your name slightly wrong, without anger, simply with clarity. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this correcting, done patiently and repeatedly, is one of the most powerful acts available to any human being, because it is not fighting the outer world at all. It is simply retiring the inner author who wrote the version you no longer wish to live inside, and letting a truer author quietly take up the pen instead. I am the one supply flows toward, easily and by nature. The fifth key is short, and it needs to be, because some truths land better as a quick, clean strike than a long explanation. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the old self-concept does not simply fade on its own. It must be let die. And here we pause to be very clear about what that word means. This is never the death of you. It is only the death of a false idea about you, the small, tired identity that called itself broke, that called itself behind, that called itself the one who never gets the break. That identity is not who you are. It was only ever a coat you were handed, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that grieving that coat is allowed, but wearing it forever is not required. Picture a woman who finally stops introducing herself with the phrase, "I have always struggled with money," a sentence she has repeated at parties, in therapy, to new friends, as though it were simply a fact about her eye color, and one day she simply stops saying it, not because her bank account changed first, but because she decided the sentence no longer described the person she was becoming, and within months her circumstances quietly caught up to the new sentence, because the old identity had finally been allowed to end, and something truer was finally given room to stand in its place. This is not loss, it is release. The same way a snake is not harmed by shedding a skin it had already outgrown. It is not tragedy when the coat comes off. It is simply that the coat was never the body wearing it. And so much fear around money comes from mistaking the coat for the skin, clinging to a worn-out identity purely because it is familiar. And familiarity can feel like safety, even when it is actually just an old kind of suffering you have learnt the shape of. Florence Scovel Shinn would ask you plainly, would you keep sleeping in a house simply because you knew where all the furniture was, even after the roof had begun caving in? Of course not. And yet this is precisely what an unquestioned identity does. It keeps you sleeping in a collapsing house out of loyalty to the furniture. So notice this week whenever you feel a strange pull to defend an old money story about yourself, a flicker of almost wanting to keep saying, I have always been the one who struggles, because some part of you may quietly feel that giving it up means admitting the years of hardship meant nothing, and Florence Scovel Shinn would gently correct that fear too. The years were never wasted. They were simply the ground this new word is now allowed to grow from. Letting the old identity die does not erase what you lived through. It honors it by finally letting it finish. So this week, find one sentence you have said about yourself and money for years without questioning it, and simply retire it, out loud if you can. Let it be finished, and let the door it closes be the very door the next key walks through. I release the old identity, and I let the truer one stand. The sixth key is gratitude, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that gratitude is not a soft afterthought, tacked onto prayer as a polite formality. She taught it as an active multiplying force, the fastest way she knew to lift a state of lack into a state of supply. And here is the reason it works so precisely. You cannot hold genuine gratitude and genuine fear in the same breath at the same time. They simply will not occupy the same room together. So the moment gratitude enters, fear is quietly required to leave, not fought, not wrestled down, simply crowded out, the way light crowds out darkness, without ever needing to battle it. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught something else about gratitude that most people rush past. She taught that it must be specific to carry any real weight. A vague thank you for everything floats past the soul without landing anywhere, but a precise, particular thank you plants itself immediately. So let us walk through an ordinary day, the way most people actually live it, and watch the difference precision makes hour by hour. At 7 in the morning, the alarm sounds, and the first thought is already about the bill due on Friday, a small dread settling in before the feet even touch the floor. At 8, the coffee is made, while the mind quietly recites the numbers again, lack rehearsed before the day has properly started. At 9, the commute begins, and the radio mentions the economy, and the dread deepens, fed now by outside noise as well as inside noise. At 10, a co-worker mentions a raise, and instead of joy, there is a small ache of not enough. At noon, lunch is eaten quickly, distracted, the mind circling the same worn groove. At 2, an unexpected expense email arrives, and the whole body tightens. At 5, the drive home is spent replaying the tightness. At 8, the evening is spent scrolling, comparing, gathering more evidence of being behind. And at 11, sleep finally comes, but it is not rest, it is only exhaustion. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, look how many hours were spent decreeing lack, without one complaint ever leaving the lips, all of it silent, all of it just as binding as if it had been shouted from a rooftop. Now walk through that same day again, but this time gratitude is placed at the very start, specific and named, at 7, before the feet touch the floor, a simple line, thank you for the supply that met me while I slept. At 8, while pouring the coffee, thank you for this exact warmth in my hands right now. Not gratitude in general, gratitude for this particular cup. At 9, during the commute, instead of absorbing the economic noise, a quiet decree, my supply is not tied to that story. At 10, when the coworker mentions their raise, a genuine good for them, spoken instead of comparison, because gratitude for another's supply announces that supply is available at all. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that resenting another's blessing is one of the surest ways to block your own. At noon, lunch eaten slowly, thankfully. At 2, when the unexpected expense arrives, a breath, then, thank you that I am shown exactly what is needed, instead of being surprised by it. At 5, driving home, gratitude for the miles behind. And at 11, sleep that is actually rest, because the entire day was built from a different material, same bills, same schedule, same actual numbers, but an entirely different state, carried through every single hour. Think for a moment of the woman who kept a small jar on her kitchen counter, and every evening before bed, she dropped in a coin, not because the coin itself mattered, but because dropping it required her to name one specific thing that day that supply had already provided. The ride that got her home safely, the meal that was somehow enough, the phone call that arrived at the exact right moment, and within a season she noticed something she had not expected. Opportunities she had overlooked for years suddenly seemed to appear everywhere, and Florence Scovel Shinn would say nothing new had actually appeared. The supply had been there all along. Gratitude had simply trained her eye to finally see it, because an untrained eye looks directly at abundance and still reports lack, while a trained eye looks at very little and still reports plenty. And the difference between those two women was never the amount of supply present, it was the amount of gratitude spoken. So this week, try keeping a small, quiet gratitude count. 3 specific things named each morning before the feet touch the floor. Not vague, not generic, specific. This exact cup of coffee, this exact roof, this exact working pair of hands. Because specific gratitude trains the eye to notice supply already present. And an eye trained to notice supply already present becomes an eye that supply cannot resist finding again and again. This is not a small habit tucked at the edges of a spiritual life. Florence Scovel Shinn considered it one of the most direct paths back to abundance available to anyone, in any circumstance, starting from any bank balance whatsoever, because gratitude does not wait for the harvest to admire the seed. And once gratitude has retrained the eye this thoroughly, it becomes possible to face something even larger, the question of how much resistance you have been quietly carrying against the very life you say you want. Thank you for the supply already meeting me this very hour. The 7th key is the deepest one, and it deserves to be taken slowly, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught something here that quietly overturns almost everything the broke years trained you to believe. She taught that supply does not arrive through force, it arrives through non-resistance, through a settled trust she often described simply as faith, and this single teaching is worth unfolding piece by piece, because it changes not only what you do, but what you stop doing, and it is the one key that all the others have secretly been preparing you to receive first. Consider the exhausting habit of forcing. Most people who have lived through broke years have learned to grip, to push, to chase every possible opportunity out of a fear that if they relax even slightly, everything will collapse. And this gripping feels responsible. It feels like diligence. But Florence Scovel Shinn taught that gripping is actually a confession of disbelief. It says quietly underneath itself, I do not trust that supply is already arranged for me, so I must force it into existence through sheer effort. And here is the strange result she observed again and again. The harder people gripped, the more supply seemed to slip through their fingers, like trying to hold water in a closed fist. Whereas the moment the grip loosened, even slightly, the water remained. This is not a call to stop working, it is a call to stop working from fear. Because Florence Scovel Shinn drew a sharp line between effort born of joy and effort born of panic. The first builds, the second depletes, even when the actions look identical from the outside. And this is precisely why two people can work the very same number of hours at the very same task, and one rises while the other simply wears down further. The hours were equal, but the fuel underneath them was not. Second, consider what she meant by faith, not a vague, hopeful feeling, but an active, settled knowing. The kind of knowing a person has when they flip a light switch. They do not beg the light to come on. They do not doubt it while flipping it. They simply flip it, expecting light, because they have seen the pattern proven so many times that doubt does not even arise. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this same ordinary, unremarkable confidence is available regarding supply, not because supply has been proven to you yet in this particular area, but because it has been proven in every corner of nature that continually gives without strain. The sun does not force itself to rise. The tide does not grip the shore in anxiety. The field does not panic before the harvest. All of it simply unfolds according to law, and you were never excluded from that same law. You only forgot you were included in it. And it is worth sitting with that for a moment, because the same law that ripens the field without struggle was never suspended the day you were born short on money. It kept running quietly underneath you the entire time, waiting only for your permission to be trusted. Third, let us walk through a single ordinary week, the way forcing actually plays out. Because it is easier to release a habit once you have watched it in daylight. Picture a man waiting on a client to pay an invoice that is already 10 days late. On Monday, he checks his email 17 times before noon. Each refresh a small, silent prayer, built entirely from fear. On Tuesday, he drafts a follow-up message, deletes it, drafts it again, wording it so carefully it takes him an hour. Because some part of him believes that if he simply finds the perfect sentence, he can force the money into existence a day sooner. On Wednesday, he calls a friend and spends 40 minutes rehearsing every worst outcome, the client vanishing, the account going further into the negative, the whole story spinning further from the one actual fact in front of him, which was simply that a payment was late. On Thursday, he wakes at 4 a.m. with his jaw tight, having gripped even in his sleep, and by Friday, he is so worn down from 5 days of gripping that when the payment finally does arrive, he barely feels relief, only exhaustion. And Florence Scovel Shinn would say, "Look closely. Nothing he did that week actually moved the payment one single day sooner. The invoice arrived exactly when it arrived. The only thing all that gripping accomplished was 5 days of suffering layered on top of one delay. Now picture the same man, living that same week, differently. Monday, he sends one clear message and releases it. Tuesday, when the urge to check rises, he says quietly, "This is being handled," and returns to the work in front of him. Wednesday, instead of rehearsing worst outcomes with a friend, he simply says, "Another door is already open if this one is slow." Thursday, he sleeps fully, because the fear had nowhere left to attach itself. And Friday, when the payment arrives, he receives it calmly, almost expected, because he had never truly left the state of trust long enough for the arrival to feel like rescue. Same invoice, same 10 days, same eventual payment, but one week was suffering, and the other was simply waiting. And this is exactly what Florence Scovel Shinn meant when she taught that the circumstance rarely changes as fast as the state around it can. The calendar did not bend for him, but his own week became livable either way. And that is the part so easily overlooked. Faith does not always shorten the wait. Sometimes its true gift is simply making the wait bearable, even pleasant, rather than something to be survived. Fourth, consider the still water itself. Picture a lake at night, undisturbed, and how perfectly it reflects the moon across its whole surface. Now picture that same lake, if a stone is thrown into it again and again. The reflection breaks apart into fragments, unable to hold a clear image of anything at all. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a mind constantly disturbed by fear about money is exactly like that broken reflection. It cannot clearly receive the guidance, the ideas, the opportunities that are actually available, because the surface will not sit still long enough to reflect them, whereas a mind at rest, even amid real bills, even amid real uncertainty, becomes like the undisturbed lake, capable of receiving clear direction, a sudden idea, a name that comes to mind unbidden, a door that opens quietly. All of these are received far more easily by stillness than by panic. This is why so many people report that their best financial ideas came to them not while frantically searching, but while walking, while resting, while doing something unrelated entirely. The lake had simply gone still enough to reflect what was already there. And it is worth noticing that the lake was never asked to manufacture the moon. It was only asked to stop throwing stones at itself, long enough to show what was already shining above it the entire time. Fifth, consider that this non-resistance is not passive resignation. It is active trust. There is a difference between giving up and letting go. Giving up says nothing will change, so why bother? Letting go says the change is already arranged, so I release my grip on how and when. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this letting go is often the very last thing standing between a person and the supply they have been chasing for years. Because the chasing itself, born of fear, was pushing away the very thing it wanted to pull close. Much like a person gripping a bird too tightly out of fear it will fly away, only to have it struggle free precisely because of the grip. And much like our man with his invoice, spending 5 days gripping a payment that was never his to force in the first place, only his to trust. And this is worth repeating in plain terms, because it is so easily missed. Letting go is not the absence of care, it is care finally aimed correctly, at the state, instead of at the clock. Sixth, notice also how forcing quietly disguises itself as virtue. It tells you that checking the account for the 10th time is simply being responsible, that rehearsing disaster with a friend is simply being realistic, that losing sleep over a late payment is simply being a good provider. And Florence Scovel Shinn would gently correct every one of these. She taught that true responsibility takes the next right action once, clearly and calmly, and then rests, while fear disguised as responsibility takes no new action at all. It simply repeats the same anxious lap around the same worn track, mistaking motion for progress. And it is worth asking honestly this week, when I grip something tightly, am I actually doing something useful with that grip, or am I simply suffering in a way that feels productive because it is familiar? Because the mind is remarkably clever at dressing old fear in the costume of new diligence, and only a very honest look will tell the two apart. Seventh, consider too that this key is not only for the large frightening sums, it is just as much for the small daily frictions, the extra few dollars at the pump, the slightly higher grocery total, the small unexpected fee on a statement. Because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the law does not distinguish between a great fear and a small one, it simply answers whatever state is held. So the person who grips tightly over a few extra dollars is practicing the very same resistance as the person gripping over a much larger sum, only in miniature. And this means the small frictions of an ordinary day are actually the safest, lowest cost place to practice trust, because the stakes feel small enough that the new muscle can be built gently, before it is ever asked to hold something heavier. Eighth, and finally, consider what it feels like practically to live this way for even one single day. You wake, and instead of immediately checking the number, you simply say, "Supply is arranged for me today." You go about the tasks in front of you with genuine attention rather than anxious multitasking. When a worry rises, you notice it without feeding it. You breathe. You return to stillness. When evening comes, you do not tally the day in fear. You simply give thanks that you were carried through it. And you sleep. Not because every problem was solved, but because you trusted the solving was underway, even while you rested. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that a week lived this way changes a person more thoroughly than a year lived gripping ever could. Because it is not the frantic hours that build a life, it is the settled ones. So this week, choose one single fear about money that has been gripping you tightly, and simply set it down, not by solving it instantly, but by saying, "This is being handled," and returning your attention to stillness each time it tries to rise again, and watch what begins to surface in that quiet, because it is often in that very stillness that guidance finally has room to speak. I release my grip, and I trust the supply already arranged. The eighth key is guidance, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that once the state has settled and the grip has loosened, a quieter voice becomes far easier to hear. She called it intuition. Sometimes she called it the still small voice, and she taught that it functions almost like an inner detective instinct, always available, always accurate, but easily drowned out by fear and noise. And it is worth understanding this key slowly, because most people have been trained their whole lives to trust only what can be proven on paper, and to dismiss the quiet inner pull as fancy, or coincidence, or nothing at all. First, consider what this voice actually sounds like. It is rarely loud. It does not shout. It does not argue. It simply nudges. A sudden urge to call someone you have not spoken to in months, and you nearly ignore it, but you call anyway, and it turns out they needed exactly that call. Or they mention an opening that becomes exactly the door you needed, and Florence Scovel Shinn taught that this was never coincidence. This is guidance operating quietly and continuously, offering direction long before the outer world confirms it makes any logical sense at all. Second, consider the woman who felt a strange pull one Tuesday morning to walk a different route to the market. No reason given, no logic attached, only a quiet inward tug, and she almost dismissed it as foolishness, almost kept her usual path out of habit. But she followed it instead, and along that different route, she ran into an old colleague she had not seen in years, a conversation that led, 3 weeks later, to the very opportunity that finally lifted her out of years of struggle. And she would tell you plainly that nothing about that morning looked significant while it was happening. It only became clear afterward, and this is precisely how guidance so often works. It rarely announces its importance in the moment. It simply asks to be followed on trust. Third, consider why this voice is so often missed. It is not because it stopped speaking. It is because fear had turned the volume of the mind too high to hear it. Picture a radio playing softly in a room full of shouting. The music was there the entire time, faithfully playing, but no one could hear a single note of it over the noise. And Florence Scovel Shinn taught that financial panic is exactly this kind of shouting. It drowns the small, clear signal underneath it. So the task is never to make the guidance louder. The task is only to quiet the room enough for what was already playing to finally be heard. Fourth, consider the ordinary shape of a nudge, because it rarely arrives dressed as guidance. It arrives disguised as an ordinary thought you almost talk yourself out of, a class you almost do not take, a book you almost do not open, a name that surfaces for no clear reason while you are washing dishes, a hesitation that rises before signing something, and each of these deserves to be treated with respect, rather than waved away as random, because Florence Scovel Shinn taught that intuition is one of the primary channels supply uses to reach a person. Far more often than the dramatic windfall so many secretly hope for, supply rarely arrives with trumpets. It usually arrives quietly and asks only to be noticed. Fifth, consider an exercise you can try this very week. Each morning, before the day fills with noise, sit for 1 quiet minute and simply ask, "Is there anything I am being nudged toward today?" And then let whatever rises, rise, without judging it as silly or too small. A name, a place, a small errand, a phone call, and follow just one of these nudges deliberately, not recklessly, simply attentively, and notice what unfolds. Because it is not the size of the nudge that matters, It is the practice of listening that slowly rebuilds the connection, and once you begin honoring these nudges consistently, something remarkable happens. The guidance becomes clearer and more frequent, not because it increased, but because your willingness to listen increased, and a person who listens well moves through their days with a quiet efficiency, wasting less time gripping the wrong door, spending more time walking calmly through the right one. And this is precisely the difference between years spent forcing supply through sheer effort and years spent being led gently toward it. It is not that the world grew kinder, it is that the ears finally opened, and once guidance becomes a steady companion rather than a rare surprise, the entire relationship to money begins to feel less like survival and more like partnership, as though the unseen has been working alongside you all along, quietly, patiently, waiting only for enough stillness to be heard clearly. And this partnership is what carries a person fully out of the broke years and into something sturdier, something that does not depend on one lucky break, but on an ongoing, living, responsive relationship with supply itself. I follow the quiet nudge, and I trust where it leads. The ninth key is simply this: let the broke years actually close. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that many people do everything right. They shift their state, they guard their words, they rebuild their self-concept, they practice gratitude, they release the grip, they listen for guidance, and yet they keep one foot standing in the old room out of habit, still introducing themselves by the years that were hard, still bracing for the return of a past that has already finished its work. And she taught gently that a door left open on purpose still lets the old draft in. So let this be the moment the door is finally allowed to close. Not slammed in fear, but closed the way you close a door on a room you have simply outgrown, with a kind of tenderness for who you were in there, because that person did their best with what they knew at the time, and they are the very reason you are standing here now. Capable of hearing all of this, picture the woman who finally has enough to buy the good coffee, the fresh-cut flowers, the coat that fits instead of the one that was simply cheap, and still finds herself standing in the clearance aisle, out of habit, still finds herself flinching when the waiter sets down the check, still finds herself saying, "Oh, I could never," before she has even looked at the price. Her circumstances have changed, but her permission has not caught up, and Florence Scovel Shinn would say this is the door standing open a crack, long after the room behind it emptied out. The broke years are technically over, yet she is still furnishing her days as though they are not, still speaking as though scarcity were a loyalty she owes someone, and nothing outside of her holds that door open, only her own quiet unwillingness to believe the room is actually empty now. So consider what closing the door truly requires. It is not a single dramatic decision made once and never revisited. It is a small daily choosing, the same way a door must actually be pushed shut rather than merely noticed. This week, when an old broke year habit rises, the flinch at the receipt, the reflex to say I cannot afford it before you have even checked, the automatic reaching for the smallest size, the cheapest version, the tightest portion, pause there gently and ask, am I furnishing today from the old room or from the one I actually live in now? And let the answer be spoken plainly, this room is finished, and I no longer decorate my life to match it. And here is the mercy hidden inside this key. Closing the door does not require that every bill be paid in full. It does not require perfect proof before you are allowed to believe it. Faith was never meant to wait for proof. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the door closes by decision first, and the evidence follows after, quietly, in its own time. So today, before anything outward has changed at all, you are still permitted to say, "It is finished," and mean it fully. Because meaning it fully is precisely what lets it become true. So take one small quiet moment now, and speak to the version of you who lived through the hardest of it, the one who did the sums at midnight, the one who flinched at envelopes, the one who whispered the tired old sentences without even noticing, and simply say to them, "Thank you, it is finished. We are safe now." Let that be the final closing of the broke years, not because every bill has vanished overnight, but because the identity that generated them has been gently, thoroughly, completely retired, and a door once closed with tenderness rarely needs to be closed twice. It is finished. The broke years are closing, and I am safe now. Here is the whole picture. Broke was never your bank account. It was a state mistaken for a fact. And the state was built from words spoken so often they hardened into a self-concept. And that self-concept had to be released, the way an old coat is finally set down. And gratitude retrained the eye to notice supply already present. And stillness replaced the exhausting grip of forcing with the quiet confidence of faith. And guidance became audible the moment the inner lake settled enough to reflect it clearly. And none of these were ever 9 separate keys at all. They were 9 turns of the very same key, the recognition that supply has been speaking to you all along, before you called, exactly as the verse promised, and your only task was ever to become quiet enough and truthful enough in your own speech to finally hear it. And if you want a steady hand walking beside you while all of this settles into daily practice, there is something built exactly for that. It is called the Overflow Covenant, a daily companion of decrees, teachings, and gentle practices drawn straight from this same well of truth, priced simply at $27, fully covered by a 30-day guarantee, so there is nothing to risk in trying it, only the broke years left to lose. You will find the link in the description below, and if you feel even a small, quiet pull toward it, Florence Scovel Shinn would tell you plainly, that pull is guidance, and guidance is always worth following. So let us close the way we began, together. My supply is already spoken. My faith is already active. My word is my wand. And if this teaching found you today, let it be no accident, because before you called, it was already answered, and your broke years, quietly, gently, completely, are ending.